Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. This is really a dream panel, and I want us to go into it straight away so we have a lot of time to have discussions and also a lot of time to engage with you. So I want to talk about, first of all, the identity of being an African feminist. And this is a question to each of you. First of all, do you describe yourself as an African feminist? And for each of you personally, what does that signify? What does that mean to you? What difference does that make in your life? And let's start with you, Jola.
Hi, everybody. So if I'm being perfectly honest, I didn't really think of myself primarily as an African feminist. And even for the longest time, admitting I was a feminist was very, very strange to me. But I think it was the realization that if we're being honest and if we're choosing to be intellectually honest, we all care about very different things. Our realities are very, very different. Our cultural contexts are different. Our understanding of the way the world works is different. The way we present ourselves in the world is very different. And so while there is the temptation to have very Western understandings of what feminism is, very Western understandings of what is important, for us, some of the discussions we're having will seem rudimentary to some, but when you understand where you're coming from and your cultural background, what matters to you is important. What matters to you is different, and that's what it means to be an African feminist, to take cognizance of your culture, to not have the temptation to ignore or wipe away or out of like embarrassment or a need to show that you are also aware of what is going on in the world to leapfrog over things that you haven't actually dealt with. That's what it means to be an African feminist to me, to be very cognizant of your actual reality as opposed to predominant Western theory of what that looks like, to be very, very honest about where you're coming from and what needs to change, what needs to be adapted, what we need to go back to with context. Yeah.
And what changed for you? Because you said initially you didn't identify as an African feminist. So was there something that happened that made you think?
Yes. So probably coming back home to live in Lagos, Nigeria, and just realizing that there are very different conversations that need to be had. Again, just culture, context, the temptation to say, oh, do we have to go over this again? I can't believe you don't know. I can't believe we're having this discussion. What is there not to believe? Like, this is your culture, this is your context, this is what your people say you are, or who you are meant to be, or how you are meant to behave. So just because you're able to parrot theory doesn't mean that's going to fly here. You come and you adapt, you explain, and you start the fight from scratch. Because you just because you can give meaning or you can define, you can explain, doesn't work. You have to start having those discussions all over again with context. That's honestly what it means. So you want to be free, you want to express yourself in a particular way, but your culture tells you that that is an abomination, that is wrong, that is not allowed. So you start having conversations with the upholders of that, which is your family and your friends, within your context, to start explaining and having those discussions and negotiations of how and why it's not okay, it's not all right, how we can be more, how we can be better. What does that look like? Because I'm so sorry I'm going on, but the temptation will always be to say, that doesn't work here. So you now have to go back and look for the examples that are from where you are to show that, no, what, I'm not crazy, this makes sense and this is why, yeah.
Thank you so much. And Lebo, how about you? Is this an identity that you use, an African feminist? Do you describe yourself as an African feminist? What does that mean to you?
I do describe myself as an African feminist. I guess probably politically I'm more of a Pan-African feminist because the lineage, I get what you're saying and I agree with it because I think the lineage of the feminisms that I draw from are definitely lineages of people of African descent. And I understand also why people are put off, as you were saying, that when you remove feminism or the way that the struggle for equality and justice for women has been applied, when you remove that from our context, it's so easy to get caught up, in the way that feminism has been packaged, the way that black women have been erased, the way that white women have been centered. Not to say that white women don't experience patriarchy, but our struggles are very, very different. So in trying to reference my own lineages, I'm able to draw upon women like Sojourner Truth, women like Charlotte Macleay, women like Fela's mom, women like Winnie Mandela, women, and in doing that, it gives me, my journey, my voice, my mother, my grandmother, their struggles, a place in this label. It also gives a place to women who wouldn't necessarily define themselves as feminists, but who have consistently been doing radical work of breaking down patriarchy, of advancing the struggle for justice for women, And I think for many of our mothers, our grandmothers, my mother in particular defined herself as a feminist and continues to do so. My grandmother never did. My great-grandmother never did. But their lives were about feminism, So, defining myself in that way honors that lineage and honors the work that has been done by so many other black women to help us arrive at this really culture-shifting point. I mean, the work that has been done in the last decade, I guess we're in this moment of history where we're dealing with all these multiple intersecting struggles, It's exciting. I mean, there's so many simultaneous revolutions that are taking place, And I think at the heart of it is the emancipation of women, the emancipation of feminine energy. And that's connected to everything. It's connected to, our liberation from capitalism. It's connected to the struggle to save our environment and to save our planet. It's connected to the struggle to center and protect the lives of LGBTQIA people. It's connected to the struggle to eradicate inequality, And the fact that we're in this moment where black women in particular, black feminists in particular, are thought leaders on social media, in cultural spaces, in literature. It's exciting. I feel like I've been waiting my entire life, for this shift. And it's also hard. It's not easy, But that label, it locates this moment within a continuum of hundreds of years of work of people who look like us. This isn't something that was handed to us from textbooks, It's something that people have been living. The textbooks help, But people have been living it. They've been pushing these boundaries, in ways that might look different to each other, but the work is being done and has been done.
Thank you so much. And Erelu, I've worked with you, so I know you identify as an African feminist. No ifs, no buts. Can you speak about the importance of the no ifs, no buts when you identify as an African feminist?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure quite a number of people were shocked or a bit confused when Lola introduced me and was talking about my role in the African feminist movement. Because Nana in Nigeria, I'm mostly known as the wife of Kayode Fayemi, former governor of Ekiti State. But people don't know that there was a time when Kayode went to Uganda there was a reception and people were milling around and no one was paying attention to him. Till someone said, "This is Bisi's husband." And then he became a celebrity. When I was a teenager, this story is a long time ago, maybe roughly 40 years ago. There was something that happened in our home. My father's best friend came to our home with his wife, with another friend, to mediate. There was a crisis. The wife of my father's friend wanted to leave the marriage. After 25 years, she was done. But that wasn't the scandal. You can imagine way back then that she wants to leave. She wants a divorce after 25 years and grown-up children. 3 of those children were older than me. But that wasn't the scandal of the day. It turns out that she had built her own house secretly.
Wow.
And the game plan was she was not only leaving, she was leaving to move into her own house that she had built with her own money, her own sweat and blood. We young women around who were serving, I mean, were like, oh, really? That's possible? There were so many journeys for me, so many stories I could tell that led me to being feminist. No ifs, no buts. But that one was a defining one, because for me, it was about voice and space. It's extremely important for me to have a voice, to be able to say what it is I want about my life, to be able to have an input into decisions that are of concern to me. I was telling Sis Lola, I just came from a wedding this morning, one of those churches that I shall not name, and I was served hot breakfast. As you know, young people would say this day, hot breakfast. All you feminists who are confusing young women and don't want them to have marriages. So because the woman wants to use her voice, she is an enemy of the state and of the people. And it's also about space, the space that we as African feminists have used creatively over the years, whether it's space for organizing in organizations, physical organizations, online, writing, movements, all the ways in which we've expressed solidarity with one another, and all the ways in which we've understood that feminism, at least for most of us, is a global struggle. It has different meanings in different communities and different contexts, but it's a global struggle against all forms of patriarchal oppression. And we need to be clear about who the enemy is. Our enemy is patriarchy. And patriarchy is not one person. Patriarchy is made up of institutions, of conventions, of norms. And the main beneficiaries of patriarchy are, of course, men, but patriarchy also has many gatekeepers and many mouthpieces, and sadly, they happen to be women of all ages. And so as feminists, we need to understand that it's a lifelong commitment. It's not a career. It's a lifelong commitment to securing voices and spaces for ourselves and fighting patriarchal norms and values with everything that we have. We won't be able to do the same things because we have different contexts, but the important is we all bring a particular game to the table to make a difference.
Thank you so much. And whenever there's a sort of global solidarity effort, right, or a political movement like feminism is, there are bound to be divisions. There are bound to be disagreements. I think it's normal, right? And I think we see a lot of tensions between especially younger feminists and older feminists. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, Julia, I'm taking you as a representative of the younger feminists, even though I don't know how old you are. What do you feel you want older feminists to be more aware of or to pay more attention to?
So I'm 30, so I don't know if that's young. Because when my
You're probably the youngest on this panel.
yeah,
So.
but when my cousin saw, she was like, "Oh, so you're the young one." I was like, first of all, piss off. But yes, I think there is an issue on both sides of humility. So with my generation, there is a difficulty in being humble to learn and to listen. We get very agitated because we feel like we have things to say and you just don't understand. And social media and access and just the vast opportunities there are to speak makes it very difficult to be humble enough to listen and to learn. And there is the dogma of language as well, which means that if the older woman you are supposed to be learning from doesn't say things in the way you want her to say it exactly, if you don't hear very particular buzzwords, you get very agitated very quickly. She's not on side, she's not on code, what does she know? But from the older generation, there often feels like there is a feeling that we are competing as opposed to continuing where you stopped or taking on a burden that is now heavy just because of time, And so that contention means that we are not listening to each other enough and we're not able to share. But I think one thing that my generation is very passionate about is we now see very clearly that to dismantle patriarchy, you cannot rely on the benevolence of the upholders of patriarchy. So there is no way to be the good kind of feminism that means the people who benefit from patriarchy will be like, you know what, they are just so nice, so polite, and so kind. I just like the way they do their things. So we are going to give up these benefits. It's not going to, African men, no. Yeah. It's not going to happen. And so there is now an understanding that there's been a lot of talking and trying, but we understand that where the power lies is in what you've said, norms and traditions, but also the law. There is very little that you can do if you feel like being a good person, if the law requires you to be a good person. How you feel is now no longer relevant. So discussions that were being had 20, 30 years ago about whether or not it makes sense to educate a woman, it is irrelevant of whether you feel it is important or not. It is the law. You will send her to school or you will go to jail. And we are now trying to figure, I think our generation is trying to figure out how to push other things that are really important to no longer rely on the benevolence of those around you, of men around you, to think that certain things are important, not just education. Because not every woman is as interested in being part of a domestic unit anymore. And you cannot be punished societally for those things. So how do we move to enshrine and protect the rights of women very specifically into law? And so we care about very different things, but I think the pushback is often from a lack of understanding, a lack of humility, and the idea that we are in competition as opposed to the fact that we are continuing from where you stopped. And every generation thinks the one after them is nuts. That's just the truth. It's not really going to change. So if we can figure out how to understand that, I don't really understand what these young women are on about, but we're on the same side and we're working towards the same thing in some form or fashion. And for us to also say, I don't really get everything these older women are on about, but in broad strokes, we care about the same things. So we need to figure out how to move quicker. There are things different generations understand about power, about mobilization, about fundraising, about negotiation. My generation isn't as good with that. There are people you don't agree with on everything, but you agree on enough things to move forward. And we need to learn that. So it's just tensions that are always exacerbated because nobody really wants to come to the table to talk, because that will mean dropping some things, and all of a sudden that just becomes a bigger deal than it really is because you are performing everything, for the whole world now. Nothing is private, nothing is, so every time you make a concession, it's, you've let everybody down, and, so I think that's just what the struggle is, understanding that we are trying to figure out how to get the kind of power that means we are no longer reliant on the benevolence of people who benefit from our suffering. Yeah.
And in a minute, Lebo and Erelu, I'm going to ask you to respond to some of what Jola has said. But I also want to chip in something because I'm thinking of Ghana, right, and the feminist movements in Ghana. And I feel like a big sort of cause of tension between younger feminists in Ghana and older feminists is the younger feminists feel the older feminists are not, they don't respect, well, it's not respect, they don't think of the rights of LGBTI people as central to the feminist struggle. That's like a tension within the feminist movements in Ghana. So I'm wondering if you can respond to some of these issues and maybe also add what you want younger feminists to be aware of. So Lebo, I'll start with you and then come to you, Erelu.
I'm 43 years old, and I feel at this phase of my life that I have one hand reaching towards the generation that comes before me, my mother's generation. I have another hand reaching towards the generation that comes after me, and even the generation that comes after that, because I'm the mother of children, And oh, gosh, it's a complicated position to occupy, but I find that as I get older, and particularly as I also unpack my own traumas, demons, pitfalls, failings, that my empathy grows and my compassion grows for the women who have come before me, you know? I mean, when you speak about policy and changing legal frameworks, South Africa has a constitution that enshrines gender equality. It is also has some of the highest rape statistics in the world. It also has, you know, femicide, and women cannot walk around at night. So, but that doesn't erase the work that was done by feminists in the liberation movement. It wasn't benevolent patriarchs who changed the legal framework of apartheid to accommodate equal rights for women and queer people. That was the work of feminists, right? And where are those feminists right now? When I look at the women that I admired, the women that I learned from, the women that I hero worshipped, who are now in their 60s, 70s, you know, the wear and tear of a lifetime of activism is showing now, you know. They are sick. They are, you know, sometimes without support systems, you know. Their contribution is being erased. And I see that even with myself and with my own generation, that there's a deliberate agenda to actively de-radicalize and erase the contributions of Black feminists. And it's targeted, and it happens, I mean, it happens online, it happens, you know, in academia, it happens everywhere, it is consistent, you know? So as I look forward at what is coming, you know, in my own life, as I look to the future and aging, you know, I think about the fact that Bell Hooks didn't live to see 70, you know? I think about the fact that some of our most vibrant and the women who have dedicated their lives to agitating for change, you know, how are they aging? Why isn't longevity promised to those women in the same way that it has been promised to some of the men who have done similar work, you know, agitating for our liberation? Why are there no support systems for these women, you know? So when I see the generation that comes after me, I'm deeply inspired by them. I feel that my politics actually are probably more in line with the generation that comes after me than even possibly my own generation, you know? But I also see how, because of, you know, I mean, I guess this is also, you know, these struggles are as old as time, right? Every generation blames the generation before, you know? And there's a way in which young feminists are so so confident and have the authority to demand for things like safety in spaces, right? That I never felt like I had the authority to demand at 20, you know? For my generation, we were having this conversation at breakfast with Zukiswa and Kina, that for my generation in literary spaces, in South Africa, Black women were actively kept out of the world of publishing and of writing, right? Even in radical spaces that were doing transgressive work of fighting against apartheid, right? Those comrades, those activists were also keeping Black women out of literary spaces. So when my generation came along post apartheid, there was this explosion of Black women's voices. Black women were publishing. Black women, all of a sudden, hey, and it's been wonderful. Black women have shifted the cultural landscape in the last 20 years, right? I entered these literary spaces as a very young woman and found myself in deeply misogynistic spaces, right? But the triumph of being in those spaces was being in those spaces. My generation was sold the idea that we are here to do the work of transformation. So when you get into the room, you're going to encounter racism, you're going to encounter misogynists, you're going to encounter all these things. Your job is to change it, right? So we accepted, well, I accepted, you know, that, okay, so-and-so is a rapist, so-and-so is a beta, so-and-so is abusive, and that these are the people who populate these spaces. But the fact is, I am here too, and I have a voice in this space. So my work, even just being and breathing in this space, is counteracting this misogyny. The younger generation comes and says, we demand safety in this space. This space must be a truly safe space for women. We don't want abusers in this space at all. And, you know, there's a part of me that just like, I am in awe of that. I am in awe of the insistence. I'm in awe of the command of self to be able to say that, you know? Because I never felt like I had permission to be able to say that. And maybe if I felt like I had permission to be able to say that, I would have had a different journey. I would have created different kinds of relationships, even in my personal life, you know? But there's also, I think, a huge blind spot when it comes to acknowledging that that authority comes from the fact that you came into a space and you found black feminists there who had carved away. So because you had more breathing room, you were also able, you had the mental space to be able to say we deserve more, you know? So again, I mean, it comes back to lineage, right? Because the business of erasure is constant, it's so consistent, right? If patriarchy wins when the contributions of women are rendered null and void, you know? And this is the path that we walk and that we are trying to fight. So as much as my grandmother's generation, their contributions, they've actively tried to erase them, they will do the same to my mother, they will do the same to me, they will do the same to the generation that comes after as well, you know? Until we make an active effort to find empathy for each other and to acknowledge this lineage, to acknowledge this contribution, to name it. I've found that it's so easy to be isolated and to be destroyed when you are singled out and kind of put on a pedestal and treated like you hatched out of an egg by yourself, right? You know, you're on this pedestal. That pedestal can easily be knocked down. But when you name your lineages, when you say, I come from somewhere, I am a product of this journey and these people, nobody can take that away from you. So that's my wish, is that we do more deliberate and intentional work of naming the women who have made it possible for us to be who we are, and having empathy for the fact that the context in which those women found themselves feministing is very different to the context in which we are feministing now. And that defines everything. That defines those contexts define the choices that those women made. So right now I sit and I'm a single mother and I don't have to get married. I can raise my kids on my own. My children are with my mother and my sisters right now. I'm raising my kids in a matriarchal ecosystem. That wasn't possible for the generations that came before me. So I cannot now begrudge my mother for getting married or begrudge my grandmother for choosing to stay married, because their contexts were completely different.
Thank you so much. Erelu, I'd love to hear from you. What do you want younger feminists to be more aware of? Or what do you want younger feminists to know? Yeah.
Well, it's been absolutely amazing listening to the stories of Jola and Lebohang. And speaking to lineages, I think one of the first things I'd like younger feminists to know, however you define young, because I remember being at an AWID conference way back then in the 1990s, and they needed an intergenerational panel, and I was about the youngest on the panel, and I was 30.
Wow. Full circle.
Yes. So one of the first things I'd like young women to know is we've always had these tensions and there is nothing new in them. How I address those tensions, however, is, was somewhat different. Because the tensions back then, and I don't think a great deal has changed in that regard, were about the older women having a certain kind of space, a certain kind of voice, knowledge, information, access to resources that younger women didn't have. And therefore, younger women were being excluded from participating in conversations or processes that they felt would have been good for them to have been involved in. Those were the tensions we faced back then. And do you know what people like me did alongside other young African feminists? Yes, I was the ringleader, but I didn't do it alone. With women like Sarah Mukasa, Eva Joyce Wynne, Seble Dawit from Ethiopia, she's in the US now, Jeanette, and a couple of us like that. We started the African Women's Leadership Institute. It was a project of Sekyiamah Africa, which is the first African women's organization that I worked for in the 1990s in the UK. It was just an African women's organization providing support for women living in the UK, who had come from different parts of Africa, within the spirit of Pan-Africanism. But during the time I was there, we shifted our identity to being known as an African feminist organization. And one of the gaps we noticed was this conversation around older feminists and younger feminists, because we were a mix at Sekyiamah. So we set up this African Women's Leadership Institute. And it was a networking, training, and information forum for young African feminists between the ages of 25 and 40. We opened up a regional office in Kampala, Uganda, and we brought feminists from all over the continent to attend this 3-week leadership institute. So eventually, we started doing them over a 2-week period, 1 week in different parts of the continent. And I made a point of ensuring that those who led the faculties at those leadership institutes were older African feminists with different expertise, knowledge, gifts, and so on. We did not allow feminists from outside of Africa to come to the institute. Or at least not as resource persons. The only time we did it was, I think, the last one, where we wanted to then, showcase some of the things that we had done as young African women, and, we wanted to make it more global. But we were very intentional about making it a space where older African feminists could interact with younger African feminists. And over time, these older feminists who occupy different spaces, because they have met these young feminists from different parts of the continent, when they had things to do, they will call these feminists, because they were now part of a network that they were all aware of. And over time, the African Women's Leadership Institute produced over 6,000 women leaders across the continent. And I'm proud to say that quite a number of them are here in Nigeria. And the current vice president of the Gambia, Isatu Ture, passed through the African Women's Leadership Institute. Wow. So my first point is these tensions are nothing new, but it depends on how we engage. Second, I think we need to think more about transitions and what they mean. I'm holding a fan now. This is a physical demonstration of transitions for women. The things that I could do when I was 30, the things that were of concern to me when I was 30. At 30, I was in the United Kingdom, a young professional. I hadn't had my child yet. That came when I was around 33. And so I had a different set of obligations and priorities at the time. With my husband, we were very active in the pro-democracy movement. We could attend meetings up to 2, 3 in the morning. And 7 a.m. in the morning, I'm on the flight to Kenya, Malaysia, wherever. That was, when I was 30. Now, I have other concerns around how I can be a better mother, grandmother, community leader, and policy advocate. And if anyone had told me when I was 30 that one day my husband would be a governor and that I would be a first lady, I would have told them, me, who went to go and picket Mrs. Abacha at the NGO tent in Huairu and during the Beijing conference in 1995, me, Bisi, I would be a first lady. Because those were spaces that were traditionally in the hands of people who used power to exclude women in particular, or to harness women's energies and labors for their own selfish interests, and women had nothing to show for it at the end of the day. But then I found myself as first lady of a state. So the first thing I thought of was, what would my feminist sisters say if I occupy this space and there has been no difference in terms of the impact I have made or how I have comported myself? And so I spent, it was 8 years, 2 terms. My husband had 2 terms, 4 years, and then he went on sabbatical and came back, sabbatical quote unquote, and then came back for another 4 years. So 8 years in total. I spent 8 years using that platform to create legal and policy frameworks that would make life that would integrate patriarchal structures and make life easier for women and children. I was able to get 8 bills passed into law to protect women and children. I was able to set up institutions and structures to protect women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence. And I was able to create an economic empowerment network that lifted thousands of women out of poverty. Maybe not conclusively, but at least it helped a great deal. And I put processes in place to ensure that not only do girls go to school because it's the law, as Jola said, but to keep them in school, because we started, you see, the way patriarchy works, when you've made some gains, they have a way of pushing back, and then you find yourself almost where you started. Our girls have been going to school in record number. In many parts of southern Nigeria, the enrollment of girls in schools outnumbers that of boys. But we found out that our girls were dropping out of school due to sexual exploitation at the age of 13, 14, 15. And so I started the Keep Girls in School program, and because of that, the World Bank took notice and added the Ekiti State onto a list of states that they were going to support doing that program. They'd only planned to do it in northern Nigeria. But because of all the noise and the big grammar that I was blowing, they decided to add on Ekiti State. And I'm really grateful that that's part of the legacy that we left behind. So for me, this feminist struggle is something that we all have a role to play in. And all the gifts that we have as advocates, as writers, as activists, as professionals, whatever corner it is we want to defend, let us bring that to the table to ensure we push back. And if one generation is able to do things up to a certain point, the next generation will take it from there. I have nothing but great pride and love for the generation of women like Jola, who I know are doing, doing an amazing job, and generations even younger than her. And after all the things that I have seen, do I look like someone who's going to sit by and allow her daughter? My niece is over there. She's my daughter as well. Bumi, stand up. Are you there? She's been married for 10 years. Do I look like someone who allow her daughter to go and sit in the house of some man who feels entitled to her body and her labor? And she will have nothing to say about it, just like that preacher was saying this morning, that we feminists are the ones who are disrupting marriages. So if there are young women out there, and that's another thing I need to let young women know, please don't listen to the narrative that tells you that feminists cannot have relationships, or we are not entitled to relationships. We are entitled to love. We are entitled to love. We are entitled to sex. We are entitled to pleasure. We are also entitled to say no to people who disrespect us, who abuse us, and who want to minimize us, and who will only feel big when we are made to feel small. So don't let us buy into that narrative. So if you come across a man who makes that work for you, wonderful. And if you've been kissing too many frogs and there's no prince in sight, please be the beautiful princess that you were made to be and keep strutting your stuff. Yes. Or a woman, yeah, whoever. Absolutely, that's important, whoever.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lara. My question is actually for, sorry, I don't want to call you by your first name, for Mrs. Bisi and and for Jola. So, okay, so I'm 20 years old and I'm a feminist, but it feels that this young feminist movement is just for the millennials, because in my schools, because I became a feminist in secondary school, I was always cast aside. Like, teachers would pick on me, both females and males, because I was a feminist. And my female classmates would let them do it. So I was the only feminist for a long time. Even in uni, I graduated and I even went back to school a few weeks ago, and everyone was like, oh, feminist, because like I was always casted like aside. So I don't know, it just feels like the only young feminists I know are millennials, and the Gen Zs don't actually care about feminism, because they grew up with parents who say, feminism is the reason why you won't get married. If you're a feminist, you'll be like a social pariah and all. So I don't know, what can you say to people like me who are like struggling to exist in this society and be a feminist at the same time?
Thank you so much. I'll take 2 more questions. Okay, please go to Jennifer on the other end. And after Jennifer, Alexandra.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Makombi, and I am an African feminist. And I have this problem that I've struggled with.
Sorry, can you put the mic a bit closer?
Oh, sorry. I have this problem that I've struggled with for a very long time. And this is, how do we as feminists pass on our feminism and our ideas to the younger generation, which of course you've been talking about. So if you look at the way patriarchy does it, and I don't know how it happens in other cultures, but in my culture, when a boy is born, the male eldest person in the family comes around with money, with a spear, with all these things, and says to the boy, this is your name. You're named like this because you're going to do this and this and that. And normally it's, you're going to be a warrior, you're going to be a fighter, you're going to make money. And they put money in the boy's hand, and then they name them. And when the child is given to the mother, then the mother carries on. This is what your grandfather said. This is what you're going to be. And sometimes they even say, oh, look at how his legs grab the earth. When a girl is born, nothing like that happens. Often it's like, oh, she's going to be beautiful, this one. We are going to get a lot of sugar out of her. But what I've found is that now, because feminism doesn't have these structures where our girls are born and we immediately strike, slot them into the feminist whatever, the way the patriarchy has done to the son. It's that there's a disconnect between the generations. And if you want to see the disconnect, look at how girls relate to their fathers, okay? My mother's generation, my mother would turn around and say, my father was terrible to my mother. But that's the way things were, okay? But my father was wonderful. Now, my generation is, oh, Dad, come on, you can't do that to Mom. But when I'm outside, I can say, my dad is a wonderful person because he loves me and whatever. Now, my nieces, I don't have a daughter, they turn around talking about my brother. He's a bastard. I'm like, oh, sorry, excuse me, that's my brother. You can't say that about your dad. But they are like, he's a bastard. Do you know what he did to our mother? So it's, because we have, and then there's all this contempt for the way, Mom, you allow Dad to treat you so badly. Don't tell me about feminism. So I'm just wondering, from the 4 of you, what can we do, to pass on our ideas to the younger generation? Say, okay, this is what I believed. This is what I did, because this is what was happening in my time. Discard what doesn't work for you, but build on it. How do we go forward with this?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'll take a 3rd question, but know that if you're not the author of Chintu, you cannot have a very long question or comment. Jennifer gets all the exceptions. Is there anybody? Okay, a gentleman over there. Can you take the mic to that gentleman over there? Yes.
Oh, there's another one here in the middle.
Okay, we'll come back to you then.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. So my question is directed to all 4. So it's coming from the perspective of a male feminist. When males call themselves feminists, there are certain topics they tell them to shy away from. such as menstruation, certain sicknesses that are mostly particular to women. And they say this because of trying to keep the space yet safe, in the sense that you can't know it all, particularly because you don't have the same experience with them. So I guess my question is, in a situation where you are the only male feminist and there are no females around, how do you engage such topics? And how do you pass a very safe message across? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I will make it 5 questions. So I think it's Tim, right? No, sorry. Not you. The gentleman in the white T-shirt. Nels and Alexandra.
Thank you very much. Absolutely a compelling panel. I want to ask you a question about, in the international context, you probably hear in my voice, I'm a British man, and, or a black British man, or a Nigerian British man. But I wanted to ask you a question about feminism as it relates to the man not. And this might be feminism that goes outside of Africa's borders, but relates to Africans outside of Africa's borders. So if you are in Britain, for example, or in America, the idea, so I acknowledge entirely the idea of patriarchal power that men, black men or African men have within Africa. That patriarchal power often doesn't translate outside of Africa. In fact, outside of Africa, black men are often treated like they're not men, like they're literally children or boys. And the same goes for black women too. But we still have the same dynamics from as far as feminism is concerned, or as far as actually how we view things. So sometimes we use the word patriarchy when there is no presence of patriarchal power, but we still respond to it in the same fashion. And I wanted to just ask you, I'll make it short as sweet as possible. I wanted to ask you what you thought of African feminism as it relates to African male and female relations outside of the African continent, where the patriarchal power is not as apparent, and sometimes it doesn't really exist.
Thanks so much, Nels. Alexandra, and then I'll come to the panelists to respond.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I had a quick question inspired by Jennifer and also the young man who said I'm a feminist. I was wondering, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how do we include men in the sense of how do we raise our sons in that terms? How do we connect with our family members such as cousins, brothers, and you said men are to shy away from menstruation things, and that reminded me, I had a neighbor who had a husband. And it was like, I said, I would never ask my father to say, oh, you're going shopping very well. Could you buy me particularly things regarding my menstruation or something? And then she said, oh, my husband, if you ask him to bring you tampons, he will ask you, what size? And I thought like, wow. And that is the, I said, wow, and that was this kind of inspiring point. Obviously, she taught him this, or she included him this. She said, okay, this is what I need, this is what you have to ask, just like shoes. It's normal for everyone, bring me shoes, you will ask me what size. So certain things are totally normal. So I wonder how do we do this move to raise at least the upcoming male generation in terms of feminism?
Okay, thank you all for those wonderful questions. I am seeing 3 broad themes. Okay, there was a question about when you're the only feminist, what do you do? I'd like you, Jola, to take that question. I'd like you, Lebo, to take the question around how do we, as feminists, pass on our ideals. Bisi, I'd like you to take the questions about men. You know, if you're the only man, how do you share knowledge about a subject that maybe you're not supposed to talk about? You know, can black men be patriarchal in the North where they experience racism and any other forms of discrimination? How do we raise boys differently? Yeah? So let's start with you, Jola.
Oh, so about being the only feminist and feeling young, I think, so you're a forerunner, basically. You're slightly ahead of your time. Don't worry, they'll come around. No. I promise you. I promise you they will come around. Your generation also has the wonderful advantage of, like Lebo and Erilu said, a lot of work done. So some of the conversation sounds a bit archaic. You know, this has no relevance to me as of now and yet, you know. there's a way you've been raised that's different, and so there's a lot of advantages that are being taken now. So it's very lonely and it's very upsetting. But I do think that one thing you can do is kind of, not theoretically, but thinking of the life you want to live and the privileges that you enjoy and what you think people are missing. And when you're having conversations, sometimes it does feel difficult, like you're hitting your head against a brick wall, like they don't understand, they think you're a bit crazy. But the essence of feminism is really women's freedom and our equality. And when you're having those conversations, I want you to think of your friends in those contexts. It's difficult to have theoretical conversations because it will always remain theory until it's practiced. That's why I said that they will come around. Things will happen that will shock you so severely. I remember being 18 and being very irritated the first time someone tried to imply that I was a feminist, because I had read feminism in a very theoretical way, and it was radical feminism about like something about, you know, smearing yourself with menstrual blood. I said, no, that's not what we do over here. And I think because it was theory for such a long time, but I remember the fear of being a young teenager and letting go of my mother's hand in the market because of what my body meant to men in the market. But that wasn't feminism, not as I understood it at the time. And the idea that people will say, I don't want to hire any woman now, for 1 week she'll be useless in the office, she'll say she's having period, I don't want. Or when do you intend to have a family? Those are the conversations that it's only when it comes back around that you'll be like, oh, okay, so this is the feminism thing. Or the idea of being haggled over because you've decided you want to settle down or you don't want to settle down, and people talk about you in a specific way. So you are genuinely ahead of the curve. And when you're 20, you feel you're invincible and you're powerful and you can do anything. And then life starts to kick your ass majorly. And if you're an African woman, the punches are heavy, you know? So they will come back around. It's just really difficult because at the moment, there's a lot of soft landing and a lot of the conversations and a lot of the attitudes have trickled down in a way that means you guys are not yet butting against some of those things. So you're just ahead of the curve, right? They will come around, and I'm so sorry that it's lonely and it's boring, and unfortunately, the people that you're kindred spirits with are a bit old. But they will honestly like come around. So in the meantime, you know, get the reading material ready. You know, so when they come, you say, welcome. Welcome, there's space, you know. So I'm really sorry, but that's the only thing I can say to you, honestly. Some things will take experience and it happening to you personally, which we always wish wasn't the case. We always wish people were empathetic enough to not have to have things happen personally. But in this case, that's what it is. It's them having to come up against some of those really, really difficult, embarrassing, humiliating occurrences that will, you know, awake the sleeping. They didn't know. It's there, but it will wake them up. But yeah, so I'm just sorry, but that's just, for some people, that's just the way it is, yeah.
Thank you. Lebo, how do we pass on our feminism and our ideals?
As you were speaking, Jennifer, I was thinking about, you know, how we have wonderful opportunities just as creatives to reimagine the rituals that already exist for women and to invent new ones as well. In many of the cultures in South Africa, and I'm sure it's probably no different here, I would guess, there's the period before a woman gets married where you get advice from other women in your family, you know, and they tell you how to be a good wife and what to do when you get into your husband's family and how to carry yourself, and a lot of it is patriarchal indoctrination. But I do think that there is tremendous power in female-centric spaces. I think there's tremendous power when communities of people with shared struggles and shared ideologies and shared identities close the room and say we are talking to each other. Like here, you know, we've closed the room and said we are talking to each other as Africans, as Pan-Africans, as black people, or from all over the world. Here, what do we need to talk about when no one else is looking? I mean, with the exception of the people who have also been invited into the space. Welcome, white people. We are not erasing you, but you are also fully aware that you are in a black space, right? So there's nothing wrong with women creating our own spaces to talk about our own stuff and to conscientize each other around the issues that affect us. Those premarital counseling rituals could become highly radical spaces. Imagine if women were counseled and told that you have the right to demand sexual pleasure in your marriage. Imagine if women were told that you have the right to leave this marriage if this person abuses you. Imagine if women were told how to protect themselves from violence or from sexually transmitted diseases, or told that there would be consequences if they were violated in any way in their marriages. So I think there's an opportunity for us to reimagine the spaces that already exist and subvert them, and also to create new spaces, or perhaps to even revive old ones. I'm thinking specifically around, something like menstruation, right? There are so many women, who are struggling with, and I mean, this is one of the beautiful things about existing in an era where there's so much access to information, right? Things like PCOS, fibromyalgia. I didn't know about these things, we grow up and you experience so much suffering because of your body and the way that women's health and medicine has been marginalized, like historically, Now we have all this access to information. What if we reimagined menstrual rituals? What if we created celebrations for girls and boys who also happen to have uteruses, because we are living in a world where we must acknowledge and celebrate and create safe spaces for trans people and trans women and trans girls, right? So what if we celebrated the the onset of menstruation, right? And created spaces where we could talk to people with uteruses about what is happening to your body and make it beautiful. It took me so many years to fall in love with my period, it took me maybe 20, 25 years to really, really fall in love with my menstrual cycle and what it teaches me about my body. Men, you'll suffer through whatever it is that we are saying. I know men become uncomfortable when we talk about periods. It's fine. You are with people who have vaginas. You love vaginas. In other contexts, you will learn about vaginas soon. And even if we cannot do this in our real lives, as writers, as creatives, as people who exist in the realm of words and art, we can imagine this in our work. We can create the templates for this in our writing. I think the other side of what you were saying, in terms of what happens in families when we start to confront patriarchy. Make no mistake, patriarchy and misogyny are very violent. This is very violent business that we are talking about. And when you start to confront it, it's like lifting the lid off of a pressure cooker, you start to confront the structural violence of misogyny in a family, and you are confronting layers and, oh my God, time, okay. The girls who are gonna wake up and call their fathers and their uncles bastards, more power to you. More power to you. And I wish you support systems in doing so. And I wish you the freedom to create the communities that you want to create. Family is not just about blood. Blood is important. It's absolutely important. Our ancestors are important. But it's also equally important to find communities of support for yourself. And if you cannot find that with the men who you are related to, go and find other people of whatever gender to do that. If it means that you have to call your father a bastard to find the mental liberation to be able to do that, so be it. So be it.
Erelu, I'm sorry. 2 minutes to, no.
Sis Lola, don't come and make our lives difficult here because we started late and it wasn't our fault. Very quickly, the gentleman who asked about patriarchy beyond African borders, I'm not aware of any society in the world that is not patriarchal. I used to own this T-shirt. I bought it from Moonstone, this feminist bookshop in Leicester Square. Unfortunately, they packed up. And the T-shirt literally said, I will be a post-feminist in a post-patriarchy. So, but more seriously, for those of us who have lived in societies like England as Black African women, you understand what it means for racism, especially institutional racism, to crush all of us as Black people, including our men. We know what it's like to render them voiceless, without agency of their own. But we also know the implications on our lives and our bodies when they come home to take it out on us. So our experience and my sister from South Africa is very familiar with the narrative of Black South African women who will tell you the numbers of layers that they are suffering and how far down the totem pole they were by the time you dealt with white people and colored people and black men and black women are way, way, way down there. So one of the things we have been trying to do on a generational basis is to break through these cycles with the tools and the knowledge and the agency that we have. So that's my first quick point. Second, I'd like to emphasize that for those who still think that these conversations are things that were imported into Africa, it's an insult to our feminist ancestors. We have always had feminists in Africa. We've always had feminists in African antiquity. They were called something else. That woman who refused to allow her daughter to be married before the age of 14 or 15 was called a witch. That woman who refused to be inherited by her husband's brother was a witch. That woman who was richer than every other man in the community because she was engaged in long-distance trade from Lagos way up to present-day Côte d'Ivoire was a witch or harlot. We've always had resistance to patriarchy. And so, as African women, whatever age we are, we need to celebrate that resistance to patriarchy, whether we are 10, 30, 50, or 90. And my last point is, since this is a book festival, let us try and tell more stories. A lot of African women in particular will not tell their stories because they are too shy, they are afraid, or simply no one has asked them. So let us try and tell stories. If you know of the story of a wonderful woman who has done amazing things, even if she's not willing to tell her story herself, you can convert that story into fiction and write the story. But we need to know of these narratives because when they don't hear the narratives, it's very easy for them to construct on our behalf.
Please help me say a huge thank you to my incredible panelists. You have been wonderful. Thank you so, so much.